have been terribly unproductive in my writing because, January went so well for me. I set a word count goal and didn't achieve it, which is fine, but I got a good amount of words in regardless. I have an excuse, okay? It might not be a good one, but I have one. I'm in this beta reading group, and we've been exchanging like 5,000 words with each other. And so I've been taking the K at a time and then editing them before I send them to my beta reading group. And because I'm busy with that, then I don't write. At the moment, I've written like 55,000 words of the current novel that I'm doing. And I was like, well, if I'm going to keep on giving 5K like every month or every 2 weeks to these people, I should probably start writing so I can like actually have words to send them. Otherwise, I'm going to be like, whoops,
sorry, I'm out of words.
Exactly. So, yeah, not great. How about yours?
My writing week has morphed into writing speeches week.
Ooh.
So I've been writing speeches, giving speeches, doing things like that this week. Not a whole lot of novel writing.
But it was writing. So, I think that's one thing about
it's a trade-off.
Being a writer is that there are so many components to it. So just because you're not physically writing your work in progress at the moment, like you are doing other stuff, like editing or researching or working on a podcast. I don't know who does that. Maybe us.
And I still have my beta group too. So it's like I have to keep up on the beta group stuff. So what falls if I need to be writing a speech and preparing for things like that? It's going to be my regular writing. So
yeah, and I have a job.
This morning I felt lazy, so I got mango, just plain mango juice to drink.
Well,
I love it.
I'm not in my own home right now, so I just drink what the other people have here to drink. So going to the classic rooibos tea, because everyone in South Africa has rooibos tea in their house.
That's easy.
Are we ready for this episode?
I'm so ready for this episode. I'm excited.
Alrighty, let's get to it. Hello everyone, and welcome to Tea and Tales. I'm Madeleine Ainau.
And I'm Sarah Sampson. Thank you to everyone for sharing our posts on social media and tuning in each week. We especially want to thank S.B. Parker and Lisa Sloan. Today's episode is exciting to me because we're talking about self-editing. That is such a hard thing for us to even want to think about as writers. If we love the creative mode, that's what we want to do. I like to self-edit. I think it's fun.
Listen, you call it self-editing. I call it self-loathing because I loathe myself every time I have to do this.
But also, we brought on a friend of mine, an editor who actually has helped me on my novels. He's a fantastic person. So let's welcome Johnny Smythe. Johnny, welcome to Tea and Tales. We're so happy you're here.
Glad to be here.
We decided to do this episode on self-editing because I think it is so important for writers to remember we have to self-edit before we send it to an editor or to an agent or anybody, because there's so many things we can clean up and fix ourselves. When an agent sees a manuscript that isn't fraught with issues, and when an editor sees one that is, okay, I can really dig in and do some beautiful fixes here, not this general stuff, that they're more excited to work with your manuscript. And Johnny is an editor. Johnny, can you tell us a little bit about your background in editing?
I started editing while I was active duty Navy. A whole lot of people, they sign up to join the Navy when want to go see the world. I didn't. I did it to escape a horrendous high school love triangle, right? Which it was effective. I actually had met a lot of other sailors that were also writers, and some of them were pretty terrible and needed direct assistance and sometimes divine intervention. I learned that I actually enjoy helping other writers to try to hone their craft. It makes me feel good that I can help someone else be better at something that they love, especially when it's something that I love as well. After I got out of the Navy, I went to college, and naturally, I majored in writing and linguistics, right? Because that's what writers think is a good idea. It turns out it's not a good idea, but it is very fun if you like to write. I got to edit a large number of papers because I was in several critique groups. That was when I edited my first novel, was when I was in college. Overall, it was a inarguably horrendous experience. That experience actually has set the tone for the rest of my editing career, where I sort of shy away from doing full novels anymore. I like the first 3 chapters. I like short stories. I also like to see the whole story plan. And I will give you feedback on that. I joined a writer's critique group out of Holly Springs, North Carolina, and I did weekly pass-around edits of everyone else's writing. Naturally, I also wrote my own stuff. Next editing work happened when I moved to Southern Maryland. I started looking at 2 of my friends' work. There was also some people from my workplace that discovered that I could edit, and they said, "Oh, you have to look at this for me, will you?" Yeah, sure, I'll look at it. Such is the life of an editor.
That's where I met you, was Southern Maryland. I hope mine wasn't as atrocious as others that you've had.
Far from the worst, right? Very far from the worst.
I love that you said, though, that you don't do full manuscripts, especially because when we talk about beta reading, we tell people the same thing. Don't accept a full manuscript until you've read the first 10 pages or the first couple chapters.
One of the main reasons that I don't do full novels is because I absolutely hate correcting the same mistakes 500 times throughout the whole novel. I want to correct it one time, and then you fix the rest of your book and send it back to me.
When I do beta reading for people, I will make a comment on one specific thing, and I will have a nice little paragraph of explaining how you should look at it. And then from then on, I just highlight the same thing. I'm not even going to explain to you.
Yeah. I also realize in my editorial experience that often writers don't see where else they've made the same mistake, right? You're often story blind to your own story. That's the way things are.
I appreciated a lot when we worked together was that you like to do what's called the developmental editing more. It's very important to make sure that the developmental edit is solid and secure before we dive into those line edits, because you might have whole chapters that change. Then all of that editing you did just gets thrown out the window and all of that time wasted.
Authors will sometimes hand me what they think is the first chapter of their book, but it's not the first chapter of the story. You have this timeline where this is as far back as the author knows what happens, right? And then this is the end of the story way over here. And where you start your first chapter, it isn't actually supposed to be right here. The reason you do that is so that your story will contain a underpinning of world depth, so that your world will feel as if it has existed for 50,000 years. If you start at the very beginning of what the author knows, then you're going to be struggling to actually fill in a lot of those blanks. When you're trying to hint at greater depth, it'll just fall flat because you don't know what you're hinting at.
One thing I like about writing romance is the fact that you tend to have to do your meet cute in the first 3 chapters. And so I'm just I just always start there. I know she had a life before the meet cute. One of the number 1 steps I think you should take as a writer is, once you write your first draft and you want to start doing self-editing, you do need to step away from your work and just let it breathe for a moment.
I 100% agree with that. Having that distance between a story and yourself is important. So the vast majority of the time, I am what I would consider to be an emotional writer. So when I'm writing a character and I'm trying to portray that he is feeling an emotion, I am feeling that emotion. It's very difficult for me to get through. If you set it aside and you come back years later, you will not have that emotional pain anymore, right? So you'll be able to look at it sort of logically and go, there should be something that bridges between these 2 objects, right? And then you are able to go back and make much more logical, reasonable edits. What I recommend is 2 weeks minimum. You set it aside and you try not to think about it. Don't edit it. Don't look at it. Wait 2 weeks. Preferably work on something completely different. And then when you go back to it with fresh eyes, you will see it in a new light.
By 2 weeks, I would have completely forgotten I wrote a book. I was just like, ooh, who did this?
My second draft is a blanket developmental edit on all of my characters and my storylines and plots and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes you realize you have to kill one of your darlings. You need to take that character out. Sometimes you have to kill a plot line that you thought that you loved, but it's just making things gummy and weird.
No, you know what is the worst? if you write a scene and it was such a nice scene for yourself, and then someone goes, scene isn't needed. And I'm like, you're not needed. What do you mean? I'm like, and then I have to go have a little funeral for my scene that I just deleted.
I never delete scenes. I always cut and paste them into a separate Word document that I tell myself I will use later, right? Because it helps with the pain.
I've seen a lot of people do that where they would just copy it into a different document. I've tried doing that, but then I read this line and I'm like, that doesn't make sense.
Like, not just for one sentence, right? Like, but if it's like a scene or like several paragraphs, maybe you like the way they sound or they're some of your best writing,
Yes.
but it just doesn't go in the story. I copy and paste all of them into the same Word document. It's pretty fun to read on like a, 2 a.m. sort of Saturday night binge where you're like spiraling down into dark depression or something.
For people who are going through into that developmental edit that are looking for like, does my story slump? Do I have plot holes or world building issues? How do I catch those things?
Developmental edits for me, it's like doing a feasibility study. So if you tell me that in your world, crystals can hold mana, they're like crystal storage devices. How many people can use the crystals? And you say, oh, crystals are sort of widespread, so like everybody uses them. Like, okay, cool. And then you tell me that the major plot point of your book is that somebody's raiding a giant crystal storage that has like 1 billion crystals. And I say, oh, why? Like, what are they going to do with them? I mean, why would you do that? It becomes a logical question of me questioning the motivation of this big bad villain that you have who wants to get 1 billion mana crystals that are very commonplace. I'm not saying that you can't keep your plot of the villain wanting to steal something very valuable, but maybe not crystals. Right? And then I would suggest if there is a common version of the crystal, maybe there's a super rare version of the crystal. That's what's worth all the money because it can store souls. That's different. Oftentimes, when I'm developmenting editing, the first question in my mind is, what's the big thing? If you had to say in one line what this book was and you tell that to me and I go, yeah, it's not a big enough hook, right? Like you need a bigger hook. When we're talking plot or when we're talking character developmental stuff, you have to start going in a bit deeper and reaching into your writer's bag of tricks, where when you're doing a plot, there are several versions of story arcs that you can have for the main character. There's the usual hero's journey. You got a version of that called the Virgin's Promise, and then you have the heroine's journey, and there's 2 different kinds of those, right? So you get to pick one, or you can mix them together. As long as your story works on an emotional level, you will win. If it works on a logical level, I don't care. It has to work on a emotional level, right? So that it grabs the reader, and then the reader cares about your story and your characters. So when we're dealing with developmental plot stuff, I look for logical inconsistencies.
And I think that's like, you have to evaluate your character, especially if you have magic involved in your story system. It's really easy to make your character overpowered. And then suddenly your story can't do anything.
When you're dealing with magic, you have soft magic and you have hard magic systems. Soft magic systems is where like nobody really knows how magic works. Like in The Lord of the Rings, you don't really know how magic works. And it's not used all the time, but when it is used, it's very powerful. Hard magic systems are more like, well, I have to sacrifice wood anytime I cast a spell, and if it's a more powerful spell, I have to use larger pieces of wood. The reader is following along in this book, and they're going to note how much wood you have on you or near you. And if you go, I block out the sun, and he knows you have a bag of sawdust, and that's it. Nope. The reader does not believe you anymore, and they may put the book down. Even between soft and between hard magic systems, there isn't really one that's better than the other.
One of the things that you told me when you were looking at my first 30 pages, I had a character who was thinking about his dad. And you're like, give me something more solid. And it made me stop and think about every item my characters carry, why they carry it, what's the story behind that item, and how does it go through the entire book. So what do you suggest when people are trying to do those kinds of additions to flesh out their book?
So there's only 2 reasons why an author would mention an item that a person is carrying in a book. Reason number 1 is that it will deepen immersion in the story into the world. Number 2, you're going to use it later. Aside from those 2 things, you don't have to write down what your main character is carrying. You may want to keep track of it in your head, but that's stuff that the reader doesn't necessarily need to know. If he has a pistol and he never shoots it, you better not say that he has a pistol, because they're going to expect at some point he's going to draw the thing and shoot something, right? It's important to anchor the reader. If your character has a great emotional pain that they're dealing with, oftentimes they will have a token of that pain. They will have a scar. They will have a family heirloom that was given to them. They will have something, right? Because they're in mourning. They're trying to deal with their pain. And people deal with pain in different ways. And I'm not saying it's a good idea all the time, but if they have an object with them, it's a great anchor for the reader so that they become more tied to the world, and the world becomes more believable that way.
Why did you just say that? Because now I'm thinking of my novel and I'm like, now I have to give her something so she can hold on to. So my character was left at the altar, and so through the
Rude.
whole novel is basically about her finding herself again and her growing from her grief. Now I feel like I have to have her have the, I don't know, engagement ring with her, so every time she just looks back at it and she's like, yeah, I deserve to be alone, or no, I'm better than this, I don't need this, and then she sells it for money. This sounds like a lot of rewriting that I don't want to do.
Well, it can be, or it can be fun. If you think it will deepen the story and make it more impactful when you bring it up later, there's no reason not to do it. You're just typing words. How much time is it going to take? How much time has it already taken? As long as you get to the end of the story and it's the best that you can make it, that's a win. If it takes you 10 years to write a book, okay. If it takes you a month, also okay. I would say that the engagement ring is kind of expected on my part. It's not surprising at all. But if at first it's the engagement ring and she melts it down into a teardrop, now it's different. Or at first it's the engagement ring, and then as she goes through her story arc, she melts it down and puts it in the tip of a bullet.
Wow. My nice, sweet romance just turned into a suspense.
What if she does something with it to help herself move on?
Yeah. I like that. So, it's like a twist on a trope or a twist on a story.
Use it. Tropes are there because they're popular, but you don't have to do it that way. You can just a little bit different, right? Just a little bit. If you have an item, as your character grows and becomes different, it doesn't have to be your main character that has an item. There's two directions you can go. You can change the item, like the ring gets melted down into something else, or you can leave it as an anchor point for the reader so that it is a cozy, familiar thing that grounds them. If you choose to do it in the second way, I caution you, try very hard to come up with a way so that the trope is not just the trope, but it is your trope. Do it your way. Maybe change the setting. We are using this soup to remember my ancestors and, in a way, sort of grieve for them. Well, by the end, you can make the same soup, but now they're celebrating with new friends and family that they've made. You can keep the soup and keep it the same, but use it for a different reason, right?
I love that. And we've gone down a lot of rabbit holes already, but let's talk about
what script?
Let's talk about line editing for a minute. First off, because line editing is Nell's nitty gritty. Whenever she's been reading for you, she's gonna dig into those line edits. But also because there's so much we can do in our own line editing that makes editors like Johnny not wince every page.
Filler words. Let's just start with that one. Yeah. My first filler word, that.
Yeah, that can be a good choice of word, or
it could,
or it can be a sign of weakness.
Ooh.
If it's a sign of weakness, it gets stabbed and ripped out.
Okay, I have a question for you though. When I eliminate filler words, I tend to be more lenient in dialogue because I think we as humans have those filler words in our dialogue versus the narrative. You have to cut it off and be like, no, get to the point.
Ooh, line edits is always it's this big topic for me, and it has to do with author voice and how you would say something in a way that works, but maybe you can get away with using filler words in certain instances, right? So for me, it's never a 100% these words are never used. That's not true, right? You can use any words. That's why they're words, right? But you have to use them in a way that the reader does not notice that they are filler words. So if you are using the word that, or just, or so, or try, or feel, or know, or start, or whatever it happens to be, you can. But you have to use it in a way that the reader remains watching the movie in their head, and they are not jerked out of the story. I don't have hard and fast rules regarding line edits, aside from adverbs should be sparingly used. And if you get rid of adverbs or prepositional phrases, it forces you to restructure your whole sentences in a way that's just better. But I'm not saying you can never use an adverb or never have a prepositional phrase. At times, that will be exactly what you need. So just know that you have a bag of tricks and there are rules, but your bag of tricks allows you to bypass the rules occasionally.
And it has to be used purposefully and meaningfully. And if it sneaks in too many times in a row, you're going to slow down your reader. When I hear somebody say, this section right here was slow, it dragged, I wanted to skip, I look for two things. Am I data dumping, and am I using too many filler words? Because that can really slow down a pace of what you're trying to do. And I really like, Johnny, what you say about specificity. And this is one of Nell's things too, getting word of words like thing and it and vagueness in your manuscript.
That's two things. One, be specific with what you want to say. Don't beat around the bush. Readers are not very patient. There are other books that they could read. Don't add things that doesn't need to be there. Two, specificity is multifaceted. Let's say that if you say in your manuscript, John sat by the window of his log cabin and smirked. Well, there are specificity things that you can have, right? Well, is it just a window? If you say what kind of window it is, does it impact the story any? Right? If the answer is no, then you don't have to be specific with the window. Do you need to add specifics to this log cabin that deepen the story, right? That help to create that atmosphere so that it feels like a log cabin. You could say, John has 3 dogs. If this is a fantasy story, you could have a breed of dog that I've never heard of, right? These dogs have horns on their heads. Something completely different, where you could be specific and that particular thing would be yours. You can do that with elements in the world. You can do that with elements having to do with your character. Being specific is oftentimes about 30% of the struggle of a writer. The big challenge is to try to explain what stuff feels like when you've never experienced it before. I mean, have you ever used magic? Well, no.
That's why I love historic romance, but I hate it at the same time, because they keep telling me like this pillar is this height and this color and this, there's a plant here and I'm like, I don't care, just get to the storyline, people. So for me as a writer then, I find it so hard because that's literally like a section I have to set out for myself to be like, okay, now I have to be descriptive, or now I have to be specific about something. And I will sit there for days and I'm like, I don't know how to write this.
Being specific does not mean adding narrative. If you're being specific, it shouldn't take more than about 2% extra words. Oftentimes you can just swap out words like on a one-to-one basis and suddenly you're more specific. Or you just need an adjective and you're done. Or you need one other extra sentence. If you are reading something and it feels like the scene is dragging on, oftentimes it's because about half of it needs to be deleted. Or if the scene can be replaced with 2 sentences. Does the scene need to be there? If you could skip it and the story still works, skip it. Being specific in that instance will not save your scene.
Just going to add to the dragging.
So being specific doesn't necessarily mean adding a whole lot of words to the narrative. What specificity means is that when you have opportunities to deepen your story and deepen the connection your reader has with your characters and the world, you take them. But you don't misuse those opportunities and make them out so that, oh, well, I have this opportunity to describe this whole backstory. No, you don't describe that.
Yeah. I like that you say it that way because that makes so much more sense now. And now I can delete half of my words. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Job done.
And I love that you talked about, you think about the item and if it's important for us to specifically know about it. I think sometimes we get caught up so much in our world building and how much we love the things we created that we forget what the reader needs.
It's also worth mentioning here, when you're being specific, there's this thing that really good authors can do. And that is when you hint at a deeper meaning or deeper history behind something. And you never say what it is. And just that hint to say that there's more behind this curtain right here. We're not going to talk about it right now. We're just going to walk on by this curtain and carry on with our plot. The reader suddenly, and usually inexplicably to them, gets drawn in deeper, and it deepens reader engagement by doing that. Because suddenly the world itself becomes more real.
It could be something simple, like instead of just saying, they looked at this. That's one of the words on Nell's list. Looked, see, saw. No, instead of just they looked at this, they glared at something, changing that word for word like you talked about. That drew my attention in, but didn't necessarily fill things with a whole paragraph.
I really don't like it when people say that so-and-so saw. Whether it's I saw or he saw or they saw, I hate that. You don't actually have to say that they're seeing because people automatically see with their eyes open. If you were to get rid of I saw or he saw, all of them, it would force you to restructure the sentence. And when you restructure the sentence, the sentence will be stronger. And if you don't believe me, try it, right? Just give it a shot.
You can't say noticed. And you can't say observed. Those other words that we like to throw in place of saw, like those don't work either.
Those are really obvious telling words. So words like I feel or he feels or I heard, pretty much any of the senses are kind of off limits to say that it's a sense aside from touch. Touch is the special one that you can use. The reason you can use touch is because people are particularly sensitive to touch. Touch usually works, but you can't do it obviously. You have to do it in an understated fashion.
You were talking about specificity, and like if you mention something here that it might come out later to be something which is like red herrings that you place throughout your novel to be able to get to it. I, unbeknownst to myself, put red herrings in my novel without actually having it leading somewhere. And then I have beta readers and they're just like, yeah, but you said this here, so I thought it was going to come up here. And I was just like, no, I just said it.
That's the rule. So it's a reader's trust issue. There are things that readers will see as just objects, and there are things that readers will see based on the phrasing and the particular rhythm of the word choices that the author uses. They'll pick it up as, this could be important later. I'm going to remember that. And then if it doesn't come up later, they're going to go, but this thing, I thought that was a major thing.
And I just read it because it was a nice bracelet. I don't know why you read so much into this, like, honestly.
That's part of what's called micro-promises. And if you do that too much, your reader loses faith in you as an author.
Yep,
you can do it. That's why red herrings are a thing, right? Red herrings are very popular in a lot of different genres, like mysteries. But depending on the genre that you're writing, the limit of red herrings goes way down. Try to keep it under control is my advice, and watch how you describe random objects that don't matter.
Well, you know what's the funny thing though? Now that I'm writing like a romance suspense, I'm like, I need those red herrings, and when I do need them, I don't know what to write.
If you never know what to write, so if you get to a point where you need a red herring and you don't have one, pull one from another novel and combine the worlds.
Ooh.
Done.
Oh my goodness. My brain just went, ooh.
I have to stop this episode now because I have to go write. Bye-bye.
This is why I love Johnny. He's so, you just talk with him and suddenly there's all the billions ideas going on. And there's a lot of line edit things that we can do. There's a lovely document we're going to put into our episode description written by Cathie Hedrick-Armstrong. And it goes through a lot of these line edits that are fantastic to make sure you do before sending to an editor, before sending to an agent. They will love you. Look at the begging.
Johnny will love you. I will also add, don't edit when you're tired, because then you end up deleting scenes that you just don't want to edit. I'm just saying, for someone who might have done that.
Johnny, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an absolute blast. May your writing be continuously better always, right?
We'd like to keep it short here on Tea and Tales. Get your fingers back on the keyboard and your pens back on the paper.
And if you love what we're doing here and you love the amazing guests that we have on, go follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Tea and Tales Podcast, and on Twitter/X and TikTok at Podcast Tea Tales. And go to that purple little icon on your device and give us 5 stars so we can go up, 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 up to the top.
Happy writing.
Bye.